Good afternoon. Welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. I am Joy Murphy, the Director of Learning and Engagement. We are pleased to welcome Mr. Alan Packwood from the Churchill Archives, who will talk to us a little bit about the relationship between General Eisenhower and then later President Eisenhower and Mr. Churchill. And we are very excited about this presentation. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat to ask questions at the end. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Packwood.
Okay, well, hello everybody. It's a great pleasure to be virtually at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. I'm just going to share my screen with you. And you should all now be seeing a title slide with Churchill and Eisenhower. Okay, so my name is Alan Packwood, and I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Churchill Archives Centre, which is located in the grounds of Churchill College at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And you're looking at an image of that now. I joined the Archives Centre as a young, naive Green archivist in September 1995, brought in as a member of a team to catalogue and exhibit the Churchill papers after they had been purchased for the nation. And of course, I've stayed ever since. And in 2002, I became the director of the Archive Centre. And what you need to know about the Churchill Archives Centre, I think, is that it is the closest thing in the United Kingdom to one of your presidential libraries, and in fact was funded almost entirely by American philanthropy. So we owe you and your countrymen a huge debt for our own foundation. I think people tend to know a couple of things about the Churchill Archives Centre. Firstly, of course, that it houses the personal papers of Sir Winston Churchill. And it won't surprise you to know that that is an enormous collection. This is a man who had an incredibly long public life and career, and who, of course, lived by his pen. So his personal archive, his papers, are some 2,500 boxes, an estimated 1 million items. But you may also know, of course, that we also have the papers of Margaret Thatcher. And not only do we have Winston and Margaret's papers, we also have 2 unsmoked Churchill cigars and a genuine Margaret Thatcher handbag. But that also is really just the start of what is and what has become a much larger endeavour. The Churchill Archives Centre actually holds the personal papers of some 600 or so individuals, politicians, military leaders, diplomats, and scientists of the Churchill era and beyond. And of course, we're still collecting. So we currently have Churchill and Thatcher and John Major's papers. Gordon Brown has said that his archive will come to us. So I suppose I can say that in some ways, we're the equivalent to 4 American presidential libraries. And our mission, of course, just like the Eisenhower Library, is to preserve the material in our care so that it's here not just for this generation and for today, but for generations to come. And it's also to make it as accessible and available as possible. So today I'm going to be obviously talking about the Churchill and Eisenhower relationship. And let me preface my remarks with just a couple of opening comments. Firstly, I think it's only fair that I say at this stage that I am not an Eisenhower expert. I've spent 26 years working on the papers of Sir Winston Churchill, in which, of course, Eisenhower appears both as a wartime general and as a post-war president. But I, like Churchill, have come at him and come at their relationship through a very British lens. And I'm very conscious that I don't have the full story. And a large part of the other side of that story is, of course, with you in the Eisenhower Library. As a result, I regard my remarks today as provisional and as a starting point for further research and discussion. And I think there are people on this call who are already taking up that baton and that challenge. And Mitch, it's very good to see you appearing in the list of participants. But I want to start with this document. It's the letter that President Eisenhower wrote to Prime Minister Winston Churchill on the 22nd of March, 1955. And he wrote it upon learning the news that Winston Churchill, now aged 80, was finally going to step down as peacetime Prime Minister and retire from public life. And in this letter, as you can see, Ike starts to reflect on their long relationship, writing, "The last sentence of your letter, with its implication that you are soon to withdraw from active political life, started in my memories a parade of critical incidents and great days that you and I experienced together, beginning at the moment we first met in Washington, December 1941. Since reading it, I have been suffering from an acute case of nostalgia." And Eisenhower then ranges briefly over those events of that relationship, recalling the shock of Pearl Harbor and the bitter reality of the Tobruk disaster, before moving on to focus on their planning for the torch operation in French North Africa, then the Sicilian invasion, the moves into Italy and Normandy, and finally onto their post-war partnership, struggling against what Eisenhower calls the evil conspiracy centered in the Kremlin. So I think this letter is perhaps very much what you would expect. It's a restatement of a personal, special relationship. And of course, as such, it echoes similar remarks made by Churchill about Eisenhower. On the 9th of May, 1945, the end of the war in Europe, Winston Churchill wrote the following message to President Truman. He says, and you can see this in the bottom paragraph of this telegram, "Let me tell you what General Eisenhower has meant to us. In him, we have had a man who set the unity of the Allied armies above all nationalistic thoughts. In his headquarters, unity and strategy were the only reigning spirits. The unity reached such a point that British and American troops could be mixed in the line of battle and large masses could be transferred from one command to the other without the slightest difficulty. At no time has the principle of alliance between noble races been carried and maintained at so high a pitch. In the name of the British Empire and Commonwealth, I express to you our admiration of the firm, far-sighted, and illuminating character and qualities of the General of the Army, Eisenhower." And in his victory broadcast of the 13th of May, 1945, delivered 5 years to the day after his first wartime speech as Prime Minister, Churchill paid tribute again to the unifying command and high strategic direction of General Eisenhower. So both that private telegram to Truman and that public statement on the 13th of May, 1945, are typical and wonderful examples of Churchillian rhetoric, delivered, of course, in the warm glow of victory. And I've no doubt that both Eisenhower and Churchill were sincere and heartfelt in their remarks about one another. But of course, it isn't the whole story. And to suggest that everything was always smooth and easy in their relationship does them both a disservice. They were wrestling with tumultuous events, enormous challenges and changes, difficult characters, think of Patton or Montgomery, and perhaps more importantly, they were dealing with their respective national interests. national interests that did not always align as closely as the public rhetoric would suggest. If we go back and look again at that letter of the 22nd of March, 1955, from Eisenhower to Churchill, you see that it goes on to discuss a diplomatic row over the American release of papers relating to the Yalta Conference, and to discuss the need to reconcile different viewpoints between the United Kingdom and the United States over events in Southeast Asia and Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. And actually, it's interesting to note that the two men do not even agree on the date of their first meeting. Eisenhower, in this letter, claims it was December 1941 when Churchill visited Washington, D.C. after Pearl Harbor. Churchill, in his memoirs, records it as happening at the time of his next visit, 6 months later, in June 1942, just after the fall of Tobruk. And what I want to do in the few minutes allotted to me this afternoon is to dig into the nuance of this important relationship and to try and understand its changing dynamic. And to do that, I think it helps to understand something of the differences and similarities between the two characters. Now, in some ways, Churchill could not have been more different from Eisenhower. His origins were certainly not humble. He was born at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire into the highest echelons of British high society. He was the eldest son of a younger son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, eldest son of a younger son, which is why he didn't inherit the title. And he was born into a world of servants and privilege, a world that left him easily satisfied with the best. And for Churchill, of course, the best meant Paul Roger champagne. It meant French wines, Scottish whiskey, Cuban cigars. When the famously austere British general Montgomery told Churchill that he did not drink, he did not smoke, and he was 100% fit, Churchill famously replied that he did drink, he did smoke, and he was 200% fit. Now, that, of course, was not strictly speaking true. Churchill did suffer extensively with his health during the Second World War and afterwards, something that we're going to return to. But I think that statement captures something of his character. He was what we might call a frontman, with his eccentric costumes, incredible range of hats, bow ties, canes, the famous V for victory salute. He led from the front, and he was always putting himself center stage. After all, this was the man who said at an Edwardian dinner party to his friend Violet Asquith, daughter of the Liberal Prime Minister, that, "My dear, we are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." Now, Eisenhower, of course, was a career soldier who became a politician. Churchill was the opposite. He may have served as a soldier, but he was always first and foremost a politician. Between 1895 and 1900, and the ages of 20 to 25, he used his military experience as a young lieutenant in the British Army as a springboard to launch his political career. He knew that he wasn't going to stay in the army. His tactic was to get himself transferred to as many dangerous places as possible: Cuba, the Indian Northwest frontier, the Sudan, the South Africa, to get himself transferred to these dangerous places, and then to get himself shot at, and then to write up his adventures as newspaper articles and books, thereby generating an income, but perhaps more importantly, raising his personal profile. He was intending to beat his sword into a dispatch box. It was a strategy, of course, that was frowned upon by his military superiors and by many of his fellow officers, and one suspects a strategy that would have been frowned upon by Eisenhower. But it worked. It got Churchill elected to Parliament in 1900. Now, Churchill's personal bravery was undoubted, but it was bravery with an aim. As a young soldier, he wrote to his mother from the Indian Northwest frontier, describing how "I rode on my grey pony all along the skirmish line, where everyone else was lying down in cover. foolish perhaps, but I play for high stakes, and given an audience, there is no act too daring or too noble. Without the gallery, things are different. Now, Churchill entered Parliament in 1900. He first entered the British cabinet in 1908 at the age of just 33. And over the course of the next 20 years, he served in many of the major offices of the British state. But it was a real roller coaster ride. And in the decade leading up to the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, he found himself excluded from high office. To some of his political contemporaries, he was an opportunist who changed political party twice, initially from the Conservatives to the Liberals, and then 20 years later, back from the Liberals to the Conservatives, allowing him to remark, anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. To some, he was seen as a reactionary figure who told the suffragettes he would not be henpecked, who championed the costly Gallipoli campaign in World War I, and who had dismissed Gandhi as a half-naked fakir when opposing Indian independence. What, of course, Churchill had got right during the 1930s were his early warnings about fascism, and particularly the threat posed to European stability by the rise of Hitler and a militarized Germany under the Nazi Party. All this meant that by the time he met Eisenhower in the Second World War, whether in December 1941 or June 1942, Churchill had already enjoyed a long political career and had already established himself as a colourful and controversial figure on the world stage. But of course, there were a number of factors that would have predisposed him towards a positive relationship with Eisenhower. Of course, they would have bonded over their army careers and their military service, but also over Churchill's pro-Americanism. Churchill's mother was the Brooklyn-born beauty Jenny Jerome, famously once described as being more panther than woman. She may have been distant during her eldest son's unhappy school days, but she used her formidable networking skills to help launch his political and military career. And Winston acknowledged her huge influence when he addressed the joint houses of Congress in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor on the 26th of December, 1941. And you're looking here at the first draft of his speech for that occasion. So you can see at the top, it's got written Speech to Congress, 26th the 12th, 41. And you can see about halfway down the page that he's added in the line, I wish indeed that my mother, whose memory I cherish, could have been here to see. And then he goes on to say, by the way, I cannot help reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way round, I might have got here on my own. And of course, it was through a friend of his mother's, the American politician Burke Cochran, that Churchill was introduced to America and introduced to New York high society in 1895. And thereafter, he took a keen interest in the country of her birth, visiting again for longer tours in 1900, in 1929, and 1931. He wrote extensively about American history, particularly about the Civil War, about American politics, and even food. You may be pleased to know that he greatly admired US lobsters and coffee, but he wasn't so keen on cocktails or the American habit of serving copious quantities of iced water with meals. But he developed a strong core belief in the importance of the unity of the great English-speaking democracies, by which so I just got a message saying that I needed to unmute. So I hope you caught that last bit. So Churchill travelled extensively in the United States in 1900, 1929, 1931. He wrote about American history. He wrote particularly the American Civil War, about American politics and American food. His love of American lobsters and American coffee, but was not so keen on iced water or on cocktails. But he did develop a strong core belief in the importance of the unity of the English-speaking democracies, by which he meant particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. His knowledge of and networks within America served him well during his wartime premiership. It meant that he was markedly more pro-American and much better informed about the United States than many of his British political counterparts. And he was willing to embrace and to champion combined working with Roosevelt, Marshall, and Eisenhower. And I think it's fair to say that Churchill's Atlanticism was reinforced by the events of the First World War. That conflict nearly ended Churchill's political career when he was sacked as First Lord of the Admiralty after the failure of the Dardanelles operation. And that impacted on his worldview. The devastating conflict in the European theatre was aptly described by him as the world crisis, because it fundamentally weakened the old order. The nation states of Europe had failed to maintain the balance of power and had been left in ruins. The dynamics of empire had been altered. Britain was left struggling to meet the cost of direct rule in her colonies, while the dominions had gained in independence, because rather than relying on Britain for their imperial defence, Britain had been forced to rely on her empire and dominions for troops and resources. The naval race with Germany in the years leading up to 1914, in which Churchill had played a key role as First Lord of the Admiralty, had undermined Britain's naval supremacy. The arrival of the dreadnought, the submarine, the aeroplane, and the move from coal to oil had created a new playing field on which British dominance could no longer be guaranteed. Revolution had brought the Bolshevik communists to power in Russia, while Russian and British weakness in the Pacific had strengthened the hand of Japan. All of this was the new legacy with which Churchill now found himself wrestling. And most importantly, perhaps, the new world in the form of the United States had been seen very clearly to come to the rescue of Britain and Western Europe, thereby further reinforcing Churchill's belief in the importance of an ongoing strategic relationship with America. And that importance of that relationship quickly became a necessity as war started. Churchill may have said that the only thing worse than fighting with allies was fighting without them. But in 1940, when he became Prime Minister, he knew that he needed America if the war was going to be won. Indeed, his chiefs of staff had told him this very bluntly right at the beginning of his premiership. They told him that Britain would only be able to fight on if the United States of America is willing to give us full economic and financial support, without which we do not think we could continue the war with any chance of success. So, after Pearl Harbor, it was in Churchill's interest to make the military relationship with the United States work, not least because there were, as we will see, disagreements on strategy. So when Eisenhower, as a senior American military figure, was given command of Operation Torch and sent to London to prepare for the Allied invasion of French North Africa, it was natural for Churchill to court him, to offer weekly meetings. And the two men would meet for Tuesday lunches where they bonded over Irish broth. I think the personal chemistry worked because they were two such different characters. Churchill was direct, dramatic, and often emotional. Eisenhower was more diplomatic and deferential. I think there was a will on both sides to make the relationship work, and there wasn't a clash of egos. And I think that was probably helped by the fact that Eisenhower was not reporting directly to Churchill, but rather to Marshall and to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington, D.C. This meant that Churchill could not simply attempt to steamroll him, as he sometimes tried to do with his own chiefs of staff and military commanders. But it was clearly in the interests of both men to work together. But again, that does not mean that there weren't tensions and disagreements. There were. In the aftermath of Operation Torch in late 1942, General Eisenhower sought to bolster the North African invasion with deals aimed at winning over the local French Vichy leaders and their forces. And this, of course, was a policy that proved very controversial, with audiences at home in both Britain and America, where there was much opposition to collaboration with former fascist sympathizers and fellow travelers. And feelings ran particularly high in the case of Admiral Darlan, the former commander of the French Navy, who'd become one of the most senior ministers in Petain's government. After his defection to the Allies, Darlan had been recognized by Eisenhower as High Commissioner of France for North and West Africa. Now, this understandably infuriated de Gaulle and his supporters, putting Churchill in an incredibly difficult position. And it was perhaps fortunate for Churchill and Eisenhower that Darlan was then assassinated. For as Churchill observed in a letter to his wife Clementine, many of these Frenchmen hate each other far more than they do the Germans. And allegations of serious differences of opinion with the United States Chiefs of Staff and with Marshall in particular over the scale and timing of the cross-channel invasion and the liberation of Northwest Europe surfaced immediately after the Second World War and continue to this day. And Eisenhower, as the senior American theatre commander in Europe, was inevitably caught in the middle of these debates and arguments. In 1943, after the Italian surrender, Churchill felt frustrated by American demands to prioritize a cross-channel invasion of France above continuing British efforts in Italy. He argued strongly for the symbolic importance of capturing Rome and the tactical advantage of being able to bomb southern Germany from the North Italian airfields. He still felt that there was potential to build on Italian success by bringing in Turkey, reinforcing Greece, and taking the fight to the enemy in Albania, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria before turning from Italy towards Austria. He was especially incensed by General Eisenhower's refusal to countenance a diversion of troops to garrison some of the Greek Dodecanese islands. And Churchill's frustration over diverging Anglo-American strategy in 1943, 44, 45 figures prominently in the diaries of some of those best placed to observe him. And few were better placed than Britain's senior serviceman, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General later Field Marshal Lord Alanbrooke. Alanbrooke's diaries, which survive at the Little Heart Centre at King's College in London, provide some wonderful insights into the inner workings of the Anglo-American relationship. And one of my favourite entries is Brooke's account of his meeting with Churchill on the 30th of June, 1944. So this is just after D-Day. And it was very clear that the Americans were no longer prepared to support further large-scale actions in Italy, and that the Mediterranean strategy so long advocated by Churchill and Brooke was coming to an end. And Brooke writes, just back from meeting with Winston, I thought at first we might have trouble with him. He looked like he wanted to fight the president. However, in the end, we got him to agree to our outlook, which is, all right, if you insist on being damned fools, sooner than falling out with you, which would be fatal, we shall be damned fools with you, and we shall see that we perform the role of damned fools damned well. Now, of course, these tensions and frustrations were not just one-sided. On the American side, the 1946 memoirs of Harry Butcher, My 3 Years with Eisenhower, contain some incredibly unflattering anecdotes about Churchill, including complaints about his irregular hours and also his rather eccentric behaviour. Now, these were no doubt compounded by issues relating to Churchill's health. In December 1943, he was taken seriously ill with pneumonia while visiting Eisenhower in Tunisia, and he almost died. In the run-up to D-Day, he was left severely weakened, and periods of convalescence and inactivity did not suit him. And as a consequence, Eisenhower had to bear the brunt of Churchill's frustrations and anxieties during the preparatory phase for Overlord, when all hung in the balance, but yet, there wasn't yet action. Churchill at this time vacillated hugely over the bombing of French towns and cities in the build-up to the invasion. At each meeting of the War Cabinet, he led some of his political colleagues in expressing reservations and in trying to limit or halt the policy. And each week it was agreed that the bombings could be continued on a limited basis, but would be reviewed. And all the while, his military colleagues, both on the British and American side, were becoming more and more frustrated with the lack of clarity. And in the end, Eisenhower was forced to intervene. He later recalled Churchill being genuinely shaken by the fearful picture and arguing that post-war France must be our friend. It is not alone a question of humanitarianism, it is also a question of high state policy. In other words, Churchill was worried that the bombing of these French towns and cities might actually drive the French civilian population towards the extremes of communism. Yet the Supreme Commander, Eisenhower, stood firm on the bombing as a critical feature of the battle plan. And in the end, Churchill had to give way. He also gave way reluctantly on plans to personally accompany the troops across the Channel on D-Day, though it fell to King George VI, not to Eisenhower, to stand Churchill down. What is clear is that both Churchill and Eisenhower worked hard at the relationship, setting the tone for the Anglo-American military partnership from the top. Through regular luncheons and meetings, they built up an esprit de corps. They certainly shared a key belief in the importance of morale. Churchill told his war cabinet that battles were not won by arithmetical calculations of the strength of the opposing forces. And Eisenhower felt morale to be the greatest single factor in successful war. It breeds most readily upon success, but under good leaders, it will be maintained among troops even during extended periods of adversity. As a result, Churchill and Eisenhower visited the troops together, and they fostered this spirit amongst the Anglo-American leadership, this comradeship, this idea of the band of brothers, reinforced through shared Irish broth, weekend retreats at the Prime Minister's country residence, and through the Short Snorters Club. Now, contrary to how it sounds, the Short Snorters Club did not involve alcohol or narcotics. Qualification for membership of this club was a transatlantic crossing, for which you acquired a signed dollar bill. If challenged by another member of the club, you had to produce said signed banknote or pay a fine. And John Martin, the Prime Minister's private secretary, explained it as follows. The rule is that you must always carry about with you a dollar bill signed by the short snorters who admitted you and any others who may be added. If you meet another short snorter and challenge him to produce his bill and he can't, he has to pay $1 to each short snorter present. The PM, Prime Minister, is a short snorter and has been caught in this way, all of which must sound, as it is, a little mad. A little mad may be, but a great way of sort of relieving tension and building comradeship. And short snorting aside, my view is that the wartime relationship between Churchill and Eisenhower worked well, in part because Eisenhower was in the subordinate position, because this allowed Churchill to play the role of host and mentor. And Eisenhower, in turn, could, to some extent, deflect awkward issues by sending them back to Washington, to Marshall, or to Roosevelt. Eisenhower also had a certain independence in the military sphere, which Churchill, even if he did not like, had to accept. However, you can see that this sets up problems for the later post-war relationship, especially once Eisenhower has become president. By the time Churchill returned to Downing Street as Prime Minister in 1951, and Eisenhower entered the White House as president in 1953, the dynamic in terms of both their national and personal relationship had altered. Britain's post-war position vis-a-vis the United States meant that Churchill was now in the subordinate position, and this was never going to be an easy adjustment for someone like him to make. But he had seen it coming, and he had taken steps. He published his multi-volume history of the Second World War between 1948 and 1952. And while he wrote the later volumes, he was aware that Eisenhower was now bidding for the presidency. David Reynolds, in his superb book, In Command of History, has shown how Churchill amended key drafts of his text, removing passages that were critical of the incoming president. He was desperate to make sure that past disagreements did not resurface and derail the future relationship. So as a result, as you can see here, criticism of Eisenhower's refusal to push on a narrower front and seize key cities, including Berlin, Prague, and Vienna in 1945, was watered down. The mutual respect shared by Churchill and Eisenhower is not in question, but their relationship between 1952 and 1955 was strained by differences of opinion. Churchill knew that his political career was nearly over, and he was keen to be remembered as a man of peace as well as war. He was keen for what he called a parley at the summit with the Soviets. In other words, a resumption of the big free diplomacy of the Second World War, particularly after the death of Stalin. Eisenhower disagreed. He didn't think the time was right, with the Soviets cracking down hard on workers' demonstrations in Czechoslovakia and Berlin, and with Senator McCarthy at his most active in pursuing communists at home in America. It did not seem to him to be the right time for a softer approach to the Kremlin. So you have this fundamental division between Churchill and Eisenhower on how to engage with the Soviet Union. Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, recorded in his diary, which we have in the Archives Centre, that Churchill was very disappointed in Eisenhower, whom he thinks both weak and stupid, bitterly regrets that the Democrats were not returned at the last presidential election. Now, that was probably a gut reaction and a very passing moment. But of course, things did not get better for Churchill that quickly. At the Bermuda Summit in 1953, after the death of Stalin, Churchill pushed hard again for a summit meeting with the new Russian leadership. And again, Jock Colville's diary reveals just how dismissive Eisenhower was of the proposal. Using language that was deliberately undiplomatic and unambiguous, Eisenhower rejected the proposal on the grounds that Russia was like a woman of the streets. It did not matter whether her clothes were old or new. It was still the same whore underneath. And Roger Hermiston has recently reminded us that 1953 was the year in which the doomsday clock was set to 2 minutes to midnight. Churchill, of course, was wrestling with his own ticking clock, which was probably also at 2 minutes to midnight. In June 1953, he'd suffered an enormous stroke. With the collusion of the press, the seriousness of his condition was kept from the British public and from most of the British political establishment. But it's a testament to the importance that Churchill attached to the Anglo-American relationship and to his personal relationship with Eisenhower that the president was told. Churchill and Eisenhower were clearly now wrestling with enormous problems that were transforming the international scene and the whole nature of warfare. In this letter to Churchill, dated the 25th of January 1955, Eisenhower talks a little bit about this, and he refers to the new element in warfare, by which he means the extraordinary increase in the value of tactical or strategic surprise brought about by the enormous destructive power of the new weapons and the probability that they could be delivered over targets with little or no warning. Of course, the backdrop here is that the race was now on to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. And it's against this backdrop that the president speculates in this letter that the theory of the deterrent should, at the very least, logically be backed up by the most careful studies on our part to decide upon the conditions under which we would find it necessary to react explosively. In the late 1940s, before the Russians had the bomb, Churchill had been in favor of the Americans using atomic weapons, or at least threatening to use atomic weapons, and using the leverage they had from being the sole possessors of the bomb. But now, of course, in the 1950s, things looked rather different. And the view from London was different from that from Washington, DC. Britain was in the nuclear front line. Churchill was horrified by the huge destructive potential of the hydrogen bomb. His focus was firmly on the West and on Europe, while Eisenhower was looking increasingly to the East and was concerned by the spread of communism in Asia and by Mao's success in China. Of course, there was still much common ground between the two countries, and the US and the UK worked together to foment a coup in Iran in 1953. But the relationship was no longer as simple as it had been in 1942 or even 1944. Even the famed Anglo-American intelligence cooperation had been somewhat undermined by revelations about Burgess and Maclean, British agents who'd been working for the Russians. In these difficult times, it must have helped to have that bond of familiarity at the top, because for all their differences and in spite of the occasional outbursts, there was a strong personal relationship. In 1955, Eisenhower produced a painting of Winston Churchill. Churchill, an established painter, of course, claimed, but unfortunately for us, did not exercise full rights of retaliation. But by 1955, it's really too late for Churchill to further influence events. Aged 80, with his health failing, and with Eisenhower blocking the summit he wanted with the Soviets, he finally succumbs to the inevitable and retires. His final advice to his cabinet is not to abandon the Americans, which is ironic because, of course, Eden immediately ignores it, resulting in the Suez Crisis. And desperate to shore up both his personal and the national special relationship with Eisenhower, Churchill then undertakes one last transatlantic trip, staying with the president at the White House and at Gettysburg in May 1959. He presents Eisenhower with one of his paintings, and he writes back to Clementine on White House paper that the president is a real friend. The tensions of recent years have clearly been swept away, replaced by memories of the Second World War. And the two men are able, as you can see in this photograph, to relax united by a shared bond of experience of high command, which is no longer complicated by national rivalries. So when Churchill dies in January 1965, it's fitting that it's Eisenhower who represents the American government and the American people at his state funeral. And it therefore seems to be fitting to give Eisenhower the last word. And I want to show and to quote from the eulogy that Eisenhower made, and which your library has digitized and made available online. And of Churchill, Eisenhower said, "He was the embodiment of British defiance to threat, her courage to adversity, her calmness in danger, her moderation in success. Among the Allies, his name was spoken with respect, admiration, and affection. Although they loved his foibles, they knew he was a staunch friend." Although they loved his foibles, they knew he was a staunch friend. A hint, perhaps, even in this final statement from Eisenhower, at the real complexity of the relationship to which I have alluded. But I'm sure I've only scratched the surface. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. We do have a question in the chat. And if anyone else has questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. I do see a few hands up. We'll get to you after we do the chat. So the first question says, after the war and Churchill lost the election, he was out of office a while, but then was elected again and became prime minister. What changed that put Churchill back in office again? Did the people of Great Britain come to realize a more conservative government was necessary, or were there no good candidates? It's a lot of questions.
It's a really good question, actually. And of course, the question that I normally get asked is why Churchill loses the 1945 election and why he ceases to be prime minister in 1945. So if I may, I'll answer that one at the same time. The first answer to that question, of course, is in the UK, we do not have a presidential system. We have a prime ministerial system where you are prime minister by virtue of being the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons. So in 1945, the real question is, why do so many people vote for the Labour Party rather than the Conservative Party? And I think there are lots of reasons for that. One of them is, of course, that many people still hadn't forgiven the Conservatives under Neville Chamberlain for bringing in the, causing the war in the first place. And Churchill, of course, had led a coalition cabinet, a government that did include Labour and Liberal members during the war. But I think there was also a feeling that, while Churchill had been a really good wartime prime minister, particularly in 1940, that he was not necessarily the best prime minister for the peace, that he was not necessarily going to rush to bring the troops back from overseas. And that his focus was going to be foreign policy and international affairs, and that after years of war and hardship, what was really wanted at home was a focus on education, on health, and a feeling that the Labour Party were far more likely than the Conservative Party to deliver that more wholeheartedly. So, and I think you can see in this a natural pendulum in British politics as well, that have been swinging away from the Conservatives during the war back to towards the Labour Party. And I think then, to answer the question in the chat, of course, you then see that pendulum swinging again back towards the Conservatives after 6 years of Labour Party administration. And the Labour administration under Clement Attlee is an incredible reforming government. It sets up the British National Health Service. It does focus very much on the home front. And of course, there's a retreat from empire, but also it doesn't alleviate austerity. You have a continuation of austerity, wartime austerity. You have a continuation of rationing. Times remain very hard. And I think as a result, the pendulum then swings again back towards the Conservatives, and a feeling, of course, that Churchill is a safe pair of hands, but also a figure who can perhaps punch above his weight for Great Britain on the international stage because of his own sort of personal name and reputation.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of comments, but no questions in the chat. So I will ask the two people who had their hands raised. It was Sanjay Paul and Ethan Anderson. So we'll start with Mr. Paul. If you still have a question, you can unmute yourself.
No, I was just saying it was such an incredible presentation that Mr. Packwood had. And, I was, as you were going through the presentation, I was kind of reviewing some notes too, that he did have some controversial views around the colonization, right? That he felt that, and it goes to your point about the international affairs, I think he would have done very well, like he did from 51 to 55 and continued to have done well. But it looks like you get branded in that kind of World War II mindset. It's similar to, if you look at Roosevelt, right? I went to the World War II Museum in Louisiana, and I visited it a couple of times. He kind of got locked into that 3-term presidential kind of thing. He was needed in the war, and he has a huge indelible legacy, just like Churchill afterwards. But it is kind of how they get defined by their times. They define the times, and then they kind of get defined by the times. But I think he was amazing. Plus, I was reading that he was a great painter, writer, like you said, all the stuff. He was a Renaissance person. Very inspirational. Public speakers still look at him. Incredible. I just wanted to share.
Okay, well, no, thank you very much. I mean, I love your line there about, you define the times, but you're also defined by your times. And I think that's absolutely true in Churchill's case. There is no getting away from the fact that actually a lot of his views and his mindset is formed in the late Victorian period. And as a result of that, he remains a lifelong believer in the British Empire and imperialism. He believes in the British Empire as really a vehicle for British power and prestige on the world stage. But he also believes in it as an important force for developing the world. And he never really, things change around him and he doesn't change. So that, by the time you get to the 1930s, his views on India in particular have not really moved. And so he finds himself actually sort of marginalized and sidelined. By this point, the Conservative government and actually all mainstream British political opinion is in favor of giving greater independence to India, giving India dominion status, starting moves towards Indian independence. And Churchill really becomes a diehard opponent of this. And it's that really which causes him to be on the backbenches and marginalized in the 1930s. But you could, of course, also argue that it's his Victorian belief in Britain and the sort of greatness of Britain and this, this belief that history is a succession of great men, doing great deeds, that actually allows him to assume the premiership in 1940 and allows him to sort of lead in the way that he does during the Second World War. After the war, during the war, of course, he famously says that he hasn't become the King's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. But in effect, he has. But because by choosing to fight in 1940, really that is going to sort of sound the death knell of the British Empire. And Churchill's vision for the post-war world, I think, was very different from Roosevelt's. While Roosevelt, I think, was thinking in terms of the new United Nations, Churchill, I think, was looking for a return towards the order of his youth and to the world of the 1930s. And of course, that wasn't going to happen. So in some ways, you could argue that it was probably a good thing that he was not in power between 1945 and 1951, because I think he would have found that retreat from empire something that would have been very difficult for him to manage.
Mr. Packwood and Eisenhower Library, thank you so much. And I think he helped to set up the NHS too. He brought the British people together. That's a huge, huge milestone. And I know you have other questions. Thank you so much.
Well, it's certainly true that the Beveridge Report, which is the report that sets up the NHS, was sort of commissioned by Churchill's government during the Second World War. It's, of course, it's Attlee's government that then implements it sort of immediately afterwards.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Okay, so we have a follow-up question from Mr. Mansfield that says, do you think that regardless of those people in Great Britain who did not or do not like Churchill, even today, have accepted the great things he did for the country and perhaps realized he was one of the world's greatest leaders of his time?
I mean, again, it's an excellent question, and one that could be a subject of a talk in its own right. The whole issue of Churchill's reputation and Churchill's contested legacy. I think that we will reach that position, because I think it has to be the obviously correct position that Churchill is not hero or demon. He's not saint or sinner. He's human like all of us. He has a very long career. Within that career, there are undoubtedly mistakes and missteps. And no one is, I think, going to agree with everything that he did. Equally, it's very hard to take him out of the equation in 1940. And to see how you then end up with the same situation and the liberation of Western Europe. So I think the issue with Churchill at the moment is that his profile is so high that it becomes in the interests of all parties to sort of co-opt him in these sort of current culture wars. If you want to if you want to sell newspapers, if you want to get your view across, then it helps you to be able to put Churchill on the front cover, either by invoking Churchill and quoting Churchill, or by attacking him. And he would probably be quite pleased, I suspect, still to be at the centre of debate and the centre of things. But often you suspect that what's being discussed now is not really about Churchill. It is about contemporary events, and it's using Churchill as a way of raising your profile and getting your argument across. Churchill is a historical figure. I would hope that through forums like this, we can start to get some nuance into the debate, and to look at Churchill historically, and to look at Churchill critically and properly. And I think we will gradually reach that stage. But I mean, it's very interesting to look at how his profile changes over time. And of course, part of the blame for all of this rests with Churchill himself, because this is the man who stood up in the House of Commons in, I think, 1949 and said that I think it will be best for all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history myself. And of course he did. He puts his version out there through his multi-volume history of the Second World War, through his other books and newspaper articles, through his speeches, and of course through his creation of the Churchill Archive. And so, in a way, it's almost inevitable that there's then going to be a backlash, and that other people are going to challenge that Churchillian narrative, and to challenge his viewpoint. And I think that's really what you've seen. It happened during Churchill's lifetime. It's been happening since his death, and it's very interesting to watch how his reputation rises or falls depending on what is happening in the world at any given moment. But I think it's also quite understandable that you're going to have very different perspectives on Churchill depending on where you come from. If you come from the United States, or if you come from London, you're likely to have a very pro view of Churchill. You're likely to see him as the man who stood up to Hitler in 1940. In the US, of course, Churchill is often feted for his warnings about communism in 1946, his famous Iron Curtain speech at Fulton, Missouri. If you come from Bengal, and if you come from Kenya, you may very well have a different view on Churchill, coloured by the actions of his government in those countries as part of the British Empire.
I think that's a very valid point, and I think that happens here as well with our presidents. Different viewpoints from your experiences, but also as the world changes, how they are seen, their leadership skills often change. We have a question from Mr. Craig that says, did Churchill give Eisenhower any leadership advice when Ike came into office? Do you know?
Again, a great question, and I wish I knew the answer to it. I mean, of course, a lot of their conversations took place quite informally. I mentioned the sort of luncheons that they were sharing over Irish broth. So unfortunately for us, those weren't minuted or recorded in any way. Of course, both Churchill and Eisenhower talk a little bit in their memoirs about the relationship, but I can't for the moment remember seeing anything specific from Eisenhower in terms of advice from Churchill. But I think, I suspect, where they were in sort of clearer agreement was, the issue that I referred to over morale, the importance of morale. I think that's something that they both saw, that they both shared, and of course it's something that they both acted on, making a point of going out and visiting the troops together, touring the south coast of the United Kingdom, and visiting the detachments that were about to go over on Operation Overlord. And I'm sure that Eisenhower would have been interested in the way that Churchill presented himself to the troops, because of course he loved nothing more than engaging with ordinary soldiers. And I'm sure Eisenhower would have been following that sort of with interest. It would be interesting to know and to speculate about whether Eisenhower actually took away sort of any political lessons from his conversations with Churchill, and maybe that's something that Mitch and others who are starting to study this relationship can pick up on.
Okay, we do have a few more questions in the chat, but before I ask them, I'm just going to say it is 1 o'clock, so officially this is our end time for our program. Mr. Packwood has agreed to stay with us a few minutes longer if we have questions, and we do. So we invite you to stay, but if you can't, we understand, and we thank you for joining us. But we are only going to ask the remaining questions that already exist. So the next question is, did Ike start painting because Churchill encouraged him?
Well, I think in his letter, Eisenhower sort of implies that that's the case. So maybe there is a piece of advice that Churchill did give to Eisenhower. And I mean, Churchill took up painting at a real low point in his life and career, quite late on. I mean, he was aged 40, and this was after the Dardanelles crisis. So Churchill had been sacked by Asquith as First Lord of the Admiralty. He'd been demoted to the position of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which was really a sinecure position. He was unable to influence events. He had to sort of watch as the sort of Gallipoli campaign sort of unfolded. And, you know, this was a real low point. It was really the first major setback in what up until that point had been a meteoric rise. And it clearly hit him very hard. His wife, Clementine, felt that he would die of grief. But Churchill's response was to take up painting, and to take up oil painting in particular. And he wrote a wonderful essay called Painting as a Pastime, in which he sort of describes what he gets out of painting, which is really, a complete removal from the sort of cares of the political world and an intense focus on something else. It's not really that Churchill paints to relax, because he takes it incredibly seriously. He gets advice on painting from major artists like Sir John Lavery and Walter Sickert and Henry Munnings. He throws himself into learning technique, and he produces an incredible number of canvases, given how much else is going on within his life. But it was something that I think was completely different for him. And it may be either that he told Eisenhower that, or Eisenhower saw what Churchill was getting from painting.
All right, our next question says, when Churchill ordered the bombing of the French fleet in Tunis, hope I'm saying that correctly, I think that's where, okay, did anyone criticize him for it? Seems like it would have been a hugely difficult decision.
Well, I mean, it clearly was an enormously difficult position and decision. So, I mean, the background here is this is July 1940. Churchill becomes Prime Minister in May 1940, and he becomes Prime Minister on the 10th of May, which is the very day that Hitler launches his blitzkrieg invasion of France and the Low Countries. And I don't think anyone, including Churchill, anticipated how quickly things would go wrong in France, and how quickly the British and French armies in France would collapse, leading to the Dunkirk evacuations and then leading to the French armistice. And of course, the whole British war plan up until that point had been predicated on alliance with France, and the idea that the French and British armies would face the Germans in France and Belgium, it would be largely a fight carried on by the much larger French army, supported by the British Expeditionary Force and supported by the British Air Force, and with the British Navy carrying out a sort of blockade of Germany. That was the war plan. And that war plan unravels within sort of 6 weeks of Churchill becoming Prime Minister. And then after the French surrender, we're in sort of completely new territory where Germany can now launch a direct attack on the British mainland. And so this is, a key moment. And Churchill's response, one of his responses, is to order the sinking of the French fleet. Now, it is an incredibly controversial move because, of course, the French are saying that they will not allow the fleet to fall into German hands and that it will not be used against the British. But, seen from Churchill's perspective, is that a risk he can take? If you have the French fleet combined with the German fleet, combined with the Italian fleet, then you risk losing control of the Mediterranean, and you also risk ultimately losing control of British waters and the possibility of facing a German invasion across the Channel. So I don't think it was a risk that he could take. So, I mean, when the French fleet refuses to surrender to the British, he does order its sinking. And of course, that leads to the death of, I think, about 1,200 French sailors, people who up until a few weeks before had been allies of the British. So hugely difficult decision to take. And when Churchill announces the decision in the House of Commons, he actually sheds tears as he's doing it. Although, interestingly, he's cheered to the rafters by all parties within the House of Commons. And actually, it was really the first time that he'd received such a reception in the House of Commons. So it was a moment that unified the British Parliament, this moment, now we're in it on our own and we're serious. And it also, of course, was a decision which sent a clear signal back across the Atlantic to the United States that Britain was serious about continuing to the fight. Because, of course, the fear in Britain at this point was that Roosevelt would see the surrender of France and would conclude, well, actually, it's only a matter of time before Britain goes the same way. It's no point, therefore, in us investing in Britain, in supplying weaponry and material, because, all of this may be in German hands in a few weeks' time. So it is a key moment. Obviously, he's criticised by the French and the Vichy French, and there are one or two voices, I think, that are raised against the move in the British Parliament and in Britain. But actually, it's much more of a moment of unity and a moment that unifies British Parliament, sort of press and public.
Okay, we have two quick questions and then we'll be finished. One says, if one wanted copies of photos you use in your program, how would they get copies?
Well, I think the easiest way is to email the Churchill Archives Centre. If you type Churchill Archives Centre into your web browser, that will take you to our web pages, and you can see how to contact us there. But it's archives@chucam.uk. We've got a wonderful team, and they'll be ready to help. But if you mention that you watched this presentation, they'll almost certainly refer it to me.
And that link is in the chat for anyone who's looking for it. And then finally, what biography of Churchill would you most recommend?
I always find this a really difficult question to answer because, of course, there are so many different biographies of Churchill. The official biography, started by Randolph Churchill and finished by Martin Gilbert, of course, runs to 8 volumes with 23 companion volumes. So not going to recommend that as sort of light reading for anyone. But Martin Gilbert did do an abridged 1-volume Churchill A Life, which does give you a very sort of straightforward narrative account of Churchill's life, sort of year by year. He also wrote a really good book called In Search of Churchill, which describes his research process in tracking down the people and the archives and finding the stories and behind the papers and behind Churchill's life. There's a, if you're looking for a very short introduction to Churchill's life, my predecessor as keeper of the Churchill Archives Centre, Dr. Piers Brendan, wrote a book, which again I think is called Churchill: A Brief Life. That is a very good one-volume introduction. But there are an enormous range of books out there. You might find it fun to actually read some Churchill yourself, and perhaps the most easily accessible volume of Churchill's own writing is probably his autobiography of his early life, which is called My Early Life. There are biographies of Churchill, major biographies by William Manchester produced a very readable, colourful biography. You've got biographies by the British politician Roy Jenkins, which goes into quite a lot of detail on the various on the British political system, which of course Roy Jenkins knew very well. Andrew Roberts has brought out a recent Churchill biography. So there is a massive material out there. And if you want to read something that is more critical of Churchill, of the sort of anti-Churchill biographies, if you call them that, perhaps the one I would recommend is John Charmley, Churchill in Search of Glory. John Charmley writes extremely well, and of course, in this book, he challenges the notion that Britain had to fight the Second World War in the way that it did, and accuses Churchill, amongst other things, of becoming too much in thrall to the United States. So you might find that interesting.
Okay, well, that was our last question. So I want to say thank you again, Mr. Packwood, and thank you to everyone who joined us. We do have a few last minute announcements, and so we'll hope you'll stick around for those. But first of all, our 2022 public programs are made possible by the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeffcoat Memorial Foundation. We would not be able to have these programs without them, so we thank them for their continued support. Please join us on May 10th for our Ike's Book Club, where we will be led by Dr. Al Ortolani with Humanities Kansas, and the book is Great Eminence, Fox Connor and the Arts of Mentorship by Edward Cox. It is available in our gift shop if you would like to purchase it. And then join us for our Lunch and Learn on May 26th with Dr. Jack Hall, who will be talking about Eisenhower and the flu pandemic. And again, this is a continuation of our year-long theme of Eisenhower, or of the making of a leader, particularly focusing on Eisenhower as a leader. And then finally, we have our World War II symposium. This is the second year. We're especially proud of this symposium. It is an emerging scholar symposium. It will be virtual, so please join us for that. And it is in commemoration of D-Day. And we will have more information about that coming out soon. And as always, if you'd like to know more about our programs, please check out our website, and that is where we'll have all of our information, anything new, anything updated. So thank you all again for joining us. We really do appreciate your support, and have a wonderful afternoon.